My name is Kathy Ullman, and I'm going to be talking today about the history of fear in INFOSEC, and essentially the part of the message that I want to try to get across today is this idea that fear is essentially what generated our industry. Without fear, we would not be here right now. But the reality is that fear is actually in our way. And so the very fear that created us is the very thing that's getting in our way from doing a better job of what we do. So with that, there we go. So these are the topics we're going to cover. I'm going to talk about the problem of fear and how fear was used in the past, sort of more generally speaking. We'll talk about the history of fear, more specifically in INFOSEC, the consequences of that fear, and ultimately how we can change that paradigm moving forward, and some final thoughts. So first, we'll talk a little bit about me. I love sloths. This sloth is a sloth that I adopted at the zoo in Buffalo, New York, where I'm from. She unfortunately is no longer with us. She lived to be 32 years old. Her name was Minnie, and she had a gimpy foot. And it's hard to see, but she's got kind of claws up here and up here and up here, but the gimpy foot's back here. So she had no claw. It would just kind of hang down, and she'd been like that for many, many years. So this is a little more about me specifically. I'm involved in a whole bunch of stuff. I have a bunch of certifications. I've been at the University at Buffalo for 19 plus years. So I guess I know a few things. I like to be active and involved both with the hacking community and with our young folks moving forward, because I really do think the children are our future. It really is true. So what's the problem in particular that we're facing? Well, here's the problem. Look at the time frame for this, right? 1989. Oh, that got cut off the top for some reason. But this is from 1989, and as you can see here, your system could be infected right now, right? We have this fear-driven language. And then this picture, which is from 2007. See something similar? We have very similar fear language. It's pervasive. It hasn't changed. We're still selling fear to motivate security. For those of you who may know Chris Roberts talks a lot about what he calls Blinky box syndrome, which is the idea that in order to solve all our worldly problems, these companies are going out and they're trying to sell you the next great technological advance. They're meant to be the easy button of their generation or time period. So, some of them say AI or ML, machine learning, next gen. Every vendor out there has their version of it. They put their little spin on it. But at the end of the day, it's just the next Blinky box. And while there may be purpose to that Blinky box, and if you're trying to solve a very particular problem, they might be useful, they are not one size fits all, and they typically will not solve whatever the larger problem is that you're trying to solve. He gets very frustrated by that, and I would agree. So does more spending actually mean we're more secure? Look at the spending numbers. They've gone up substantially between last year and this year. So, we're more secure now, right? Yet no. So if you look at these numbers, and I still don't know why, is it the projector? Okay. Oh, yeah. So I'm sorry that these numbers aren't so great. So anyway, but if you look at the details here, what you'll see is that the actual numbers of incidents have gone down, but the number of actual pieces of data that have been lost or stolen or taken by somebody that shouldn't have taken them or viewed them is up way, way more. So how did we get to a point where we're selling Blinky boxes and people are still buying them if we spent all this money and we're not anymore secure? Fear. Fear is the driver. And fear is by design with a lot of things involving money. For example, the World War II Japanese internment camps. For any of you who are not familiar, the Japanese in the United States were put into these camps because people did not trust them during World War II. We were so afraid of them, we're going to bottle them all up and go ship them off somewhere, instead of realizing that these were Japanese Americans. They were just as much a part of this country as any one of us. And then, of course, our battles with Russia, right? The Cold War. We feared communism and anything associated with it, and lots of media took advantage of that. So where are the beginnings of security? Well, the real beginnings of security go really far back. But in terms of IT security and the stuff that most people know about, and this is going to be a very quick jump because I could spend a lot more time on this, but I purposely kept this part relatively short just to give you some context for where we're going. And the orange book here was the first of the colored, the beautiful rainbow of colors that existed. It came out in 1985, and really at that time there was no information security. We had no cyber, you may now drink. And really this book focused on risk and compliance. It was meant to be something you consulted when you were purchasing equipment. This is really all there was. And people didn't think about security. No one had a computer in their home. This just wasn't a thing at the time. Then you fast forward a little bit, and we have the beginnings of the internet. So we have the DoD, who actually starts the project. We have DARPANET, then we have ARPANET. ARPANET begins to expand. This is actually a very early picture from 1970 from a bunch of different schools that become all interconnected. For me personally, ARPANET led to what was something called BitNet, which was a bunch of networks that connected a variety of universities. In particular, my hometown had a university that was part of BitNet. What was kind of cool about BitNet is it used technology from the IBM mainframe days, and that's how all these machines were connected. And you could do things like send email and transfer files, and it was very much the way we think of how TCP/IP works today in terms of that functionality, but it wasn't using TCP/IP, it was using the protocols that the IBM mainframe used. And eventually, that technology was actually ported to other mainframes, which is how I grew up in a little town called Fredonia, New York, and the State University College of Fredonia had that technology in place, and I was 4 years old and growing up with some of this technology. So it didn't occur to me at the time that this was a thing. All I knew is that I was living in a house that had a terminal that was always on, and my father periodically would take this funny thing he'd connect the telephone to that made noise, which I didn't realize later was what everybody else dealt with in terms of you know, that screechy modem noise. I didn't know anything about that. But for me, BitNet was my first experience connecting out to other systems, connecting in and talking to people on other systems using much like we do instant messenger today. So fast forward a little further, we get into some of these early security developments. So we see this first PC virus called Brain. Who remembers or knows what Brain was? A couple of people? All right. So for those of you who don't know, really all Brain was meant to do was be copyright protection. It was against copyright infringement. That's what its creator had intended. And these two guys who created it wound up getting bombarded because people discovered that for some reason it was overwriting their files. And so they got countless phone calls and people furious about this, and there was nothing you could do about this aside from wipe your machine and start over. So John McAfee is fascinated by this, and this is the beginning of his legacy. He takes a look at this software and he decides to reverse engineer it with the goal of providing an antivirus solution, a way to stop, prevent, or clean the system as a result of this. And a year later is when he actually starts McAfee. So in 87, he starts McAfee. By late 87, we have the debut of Sophos and Symantec, and it's not too long before we get to a point where there are actually more vendors of AV software than there are viruses, because people are afraid. They're starting to see there could be a problem here. Now, what's going on in the government at this point? They're terrified. These quotes come from an article that was in a Toronto newspaper in 1986. And they were interviewing these researchers from the US government who were saying things like, oh no, it could be a potentially devastating weapon, these viruses. Now, think about it. Have you heard anything that sounds like that recently? Potentially devastating virus? Yeah. None of this has changed. In fact, I'd argue to a large degree, security has not changed tremendously in terms of that interaction at all. So the government, to a certain degree, was right to be worried, because we only have a small subset of computers on the internet compared to what we have now. But even so, in 1988, when the Morris worm hits, which is only 2 years after these quotes happen, 1/10 of the computers from the internet are taken out by that. That's a huge chunk. Can you imagine if today 1/10 of the computers on the internet were suddenly just offline because something hit? That would be really bad. And we've certainly seen over time where various worms Trojans and things have taken out chunks of networks. Now, I mean, certainly at our university, we periodically see different kinds of ransomware that'll take an entire department out because somebody clicked on something they shouldn't have, and a whole departmental directory gets taken out. But that's a whole lot different from every single machine in the whole department is now taken out because it's been hit by something. We see that a lot less today, but it still happens. So the government's response to that is to create this first computer emergency response team, and their purpose is to research and handle what, of course, they refer to as responsible disclosure of software vulnerabilities, and that's at Carnegie Mellon. So that fear translates to dollars. And at this point, by 1990, companies are saying, well, given what happened with Morris, maybe it's not so bad that we're spending some money on this. $5 to $10 a machine per month, or a couple of salaries for people to help out with this kind of thing, that doesn't seem so bad when worldwide we're talking about $1.5 million dealing with malware. Like, all right, now we need to put some money to this. So fear is driving all of this. They're afraid now of what's on the outside. And we start at this point to see the beginnings of internet security, which is kind of the early book. And I can thank Jeff Mann for this image, because this actually comes from his presentation. The book on the left is from 91, the book on the right is from 2003, but you can see this is kind of the same pattern. We don't get into cyber or any of this later terminology for quite some time. And this also I attribute to Jeff, and I thank him for that. Then we have the beginning of personal computers become a thing. Everybody wants them in their home. Mosaic makes its appearance, and everybody wants to be on the internet, not just these schools and research facilities where all of this started. That changes everything. And at this point, it's just a matter of trust. And you'll notice this is another McAfee ad from way back when, right? And this is actually a slam against Symantec, if you were to read the fine print. Symantec had published something about how great their product was, and he found some flaws in what they said, and you can actually go back and forth and read some of this. I couldn't find the grand details, and with John being on the run again and having some issues, I couldn't get a whole lot of answers. But in any case, that leads us to Blinky boxes. Well, not these kind of Blinky boxes. More like these kind of Blinky boxes. So I couldn't find a picture of the early DEC Seal, which was the first commercially available firewall. So now we're into the early 90s. We're putting in these firewalls because we're worried about that connection to the internet. And these devices are considered virtually fail-safe protection. Yes! We're safe, no problem. And then in 95, Mitnick hacks the supercomputing center in San Diego, California, and all bets are off. So here we have the beginnings of the Blinky box. Those firewalls were, in fact, those first Blinky boxes. And you know what that led to? All kinds of chaos. So what are the consequences of the fact that, fear has been ongoing for so long? Well, let's look at fear as a motivational tool. There are a number of studies that have been done, and my friend Claire Tillis, who actually has done a fair amount of research on this particular topic, was kind enough to send me a bunch of articles, and I didn't want to bore you with tons of statistics, but the reality is that fear is a really bad motivator. It can be a good motivator in short bursts for very specific things, but it's difficult to gauge. If you have too much fear typically people just become paralyzed or they become controlled by that fear in such a way that they have to do something. Think in terms of sports teams. This is a strange analogy. But anybody who watches any kind of professional sports teams or even non-professional sport teams, if they get on a winning streak and they ultimately are, doing really well, how many sports teams do you know that don't have some sort of thing, ritual that they constantly do? They grow out a beard, right? Or they don't shave, or they continue to grow out a beard, or they have to kiss a statue, or any one of a number of crazy things. And, why are they doing that? Well, they're afraid. They're afraid they're going to lose. So they're going to perpetuate and do the same thing over and over again. And all people are kind of the same way, and they will do that. If you don't use enough fear, people are complacent and they just don't care, right? If you don't give them a reason to care, they're just not going to care. Ultimately, that fear you can wind up with a negative impression of a company. If you scare the hell out of people too much, they're going to say, I don't want to do business with these folks because they scare me. And you're starting to see more and more scare campaigns. Certainly, we're seeing at least a few against Facebook about the kind of data they're stealing. Now, that doesn't mean that what they're doing is somehow not wrong, but the fear that's being generated isn't necessarily helpful. And, any sort of overreactive response is really typical. So let's talk about FUD. How many here have heard of the term FUD? Okay, almost all of you. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that the origins of FUD, at least in the information, the IT sort of space, is not kind of what we think of it now, which is in a very general sense. Any kind of fear and uncertainty and doubt is what we often think of right now. But the origins of this start with IBM, and the very, very specific use of fear, and that fear has to do with spreading misinformation about a competitor's product. It starts with IBM and a former employee of theirs, Gene Amdahl. Amdahl leaves IBM because he actually doesn't like what's going on, and he's got some ideas about how he can improve the computer product. So he goes out and he manufactures his own computers, and he comes up with this really brilliant design that involves putting the power supply on the outside of the case. And because he does this, you don't need a fan. What does IBM do? They start saying, oh, you don't want to buy these new machines from this company, this other company. You want to stick with the tried and true IBM Blue because he doesn't have fans. Now, forget the fact that you don't need them because he purposely designs them that way. And in fact, the processors he was using were actually, they were a head and tail above what IBM was using at the time because he had the knowledge and he went ahead and he, built them to be better. But no one wanted to hear what he had to say because IBM drowned them out with fear. So this is the original FUD that we've now turned into something a little more glossed over as far as, any sort of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But this is kind of where it starts. It's directly going against your competitors. And, the reality is, I love this quote from Rick Smith, the security industry generates FUD in order to sell hope. And he's talking more generically about FUD, but I think we could also say the same thing about IBM. The sad thing is, it's still going on today. What you can't see, in part because it's cut off at the bottom here, this is a slide from an internal IBM document that was literally supposed to be internal use only from like 2008 or 9. And if you read some of this, they're slamming EMC. And they're doing exactly the same thing. Oh, you don't want to buy their product, and let me tell you why. So their game hasn't changed at all. Do we have an image problem? I'd say we do. Especially any of you who follows Chris Roberts knows that Chris has a real hate for the hoodie hacker image, right? And this woman at Duo, I think, sums it up beautifully in this quote, where she basically says, look, the media is generating these false images and creating an expectation for us. I mean, this is her actual quote. But reality, we fear what we don't understand. So we wind up with this image. And it's these kind of images we see all over the place, right? And I don't know anybody who's a hacker that can do that with gloves on. And how the hell you see through goggles on a face mask. Like, I don't know how one does that. That's kind of crazy. Yeah, that's totally elite. Super lead, yeah. So, so the reality is that a hacker, regardless of the space, really is somebody who understands something at a level beyond what it was intended to do. So in terms of computing, again, I really like this quote from Rich, I'm not saying anything wonderful about Duo. The university is actually in the process of rolling out Duo, so I reserve comment because I honestly have no idea how it's going to go. But Rich is a phenomenal speaker, and I really enjoyed this quote where he talks about the idea that what a hacker is somebody who understands really how computers work and not just how they're meant to work. And you can take that information and you can really spread it to any area of interest. So it can be computers, it can be anything. Because we all hack stuff that's not computers, right? I mean, if you hack a door, if you hack a person, doesn't matter. It's the same idea. You're learning how something or someone really works, and not just how it's supposed to be or how you were told that it worked. We see fear in the development world too. My husband's a developer, and we spent a bunch of time talking about this because I had a sense of it. I have a number of friends who are developers, and I work in a major university where it's one of the subjects that we teach. And I said to him, so let's talk about fear in the dev world. Do you have the same kinds of fear that we see just in the general public? And he said, absolutely. Because we're under the gun to get stuff done. There are usually ridiculous deadlines that get set for developers. And we don't have the training necessarily because really when you go to school for this stuff, or even if you learn on your own, where do they teach you how to secure from the bottom up? They don't. It's always an add-on. This is a really serious problem. And oh my goodness, what happens if you're a dev and your code is responsible for a 0 day? I mean, that's just a horrible thing. And people who are coding, this is something they're really afraid of. So it's going to take additional time, and it's very stressful. So what do we see in all of this? We see a lot of consistency. Consistency normally is a really good thing, right? If you do something well and you repeat it, and certainly in science, we want repeatable results. The problem that I see in this industry, and I hear this over and over again, is we're broken, right? And part of where this talk stemmed from is I hear we're broken, and nobody says, and here's how we fix us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to do that. But first we need to understand that it's in part our consistency that is our downfall. And the reason I say that is because in reality, we keep doing the same things over and over again, right? Security is always an afterthought. In business, in classes, we purchase Blinky boxes to be this easy button. We do these things over and over again. And certainly, we see that that's the definition of insanity. Doing this over and over again? Absolutely. That's insane. Is there a ramification to that? Hell yeah. Fear leads to hate. And this next study that I'm going to show you I found really surprising. So I know for a fact, from being in this business a while and from talking to people who are not in this business, how many people think that the security folks are loved outside of our own little universe? Anybody agree with that? We're loved. Everybody loves us, right? No. No, not so much. So I found this study, which is from this psychotic report which was actually called Everyone Hates Cybersecurity Professionals. Why are we hated? Well, this is why. This is how we're seen. We're doom-mongers. We're policemen. Right? We're massively understood. Whose fault is that? Ours. I mean, I get the fact that we're in a weird position, depending on what role exactly you play, but the only way we're going to fix this for ourselves is to change this conversation. Here's some more examples. And I didn't have a chance to add this because I couldn't find the exact words, but I have a friend who's not in this business. Strangely enough, she has a law degree, but she works for an electric company, I think. I know it's a utility. And she was very frustrated one day, and she's putting something out on Facebook about how her support people drive her crazy because She asked a question and she couldn't get a good answer, and it was just something slamming the fact that whoever her support people were, they weren't listening. And I hear that over and over again. And at the end of the day, that's still us, right? And whether you're in security or you're doing support, we don't always listen. We also are seen as this reactive and cost center, and sometimes we're just keeping the lights on. That's really all we do. So it's no wonder that this becomes a definition of who we are. Yeah. And so, I say to you, we need to change the paradigm. How many of you have ever seen this image before on the bottom? Quite a few of you. So for any of you who haven't seen this image, or for maybe those of you who don't know the history behind it, this is an image that's used in psychology frequently. And the idea is that if you look at it in one way, it's a bunny, and if you look at it in another way, it's a duck. It's a shift, and it's a very subtle shift. So we're not talking about grandiose change, which sometimes is what I feel like when we talk about making those changes in this industry. They have to be these huge changes. I think to affect change, we don't have to make giant changes. We need to make small, graduated changes that ultimately impact people more. Us versus them. Boy, do I hear this all the time. Security versus every other entity in IT. Security versus finance. IT versus end user. Security versus No. At the end of the day, I don't care who you work for. Aren't we in this together? Because if our company does badly, are we out of a job too? Yeah, probably. And we get so wrapped up in doing stuff to stay secure, which is a whole other topic that I'm working on a project right now about, Jeff Mann influenced me a little. I have this idea about the fact that he gave me about security being a verb. And what we do is security. And the end goal is not security. Because you can never be fully secure. Even if you shut it down and turn it off, we're not fully secure. But that's another talk for another time. The point is we can't be us versus them. We need to embrace everybody else as much as we often don't want to embrace even each other because peopling is hard, right? We have to be patient. We have to really listen. We have to follow through. If we promise we're going to do something, we need to find a way to write it down and make it happen, even if it's just to explain something to somebody, even if you can't make that change directly. We need to illuminate to build a community of trust, because there's lots of distrust there. You need to provide communication at a level people both can understand and relate to, because otherwise, this is what you get. Not effective or efficient. So here's where we get into some of this paradigm shift. We need to replace fear with a healthy skepticism. It's okay that people see things and don't trust them. It is not okay that they're so afraid they don't know what to do with that. When I have folks who write in and send us stuff to the abuse queue at the university, and they're asking specifically for, is this legitimate, or what do I do with this? The first thing I say in every case is, thank you for being skeptical and suspicious. You did the right thing. You question that. This is an awesome thing that you're doing. And then I give them more information. So we need to play devil's advocate. We need to be questioning things. Certainly if anybody saw April's presentation about the deep fakes that are going on in the world, boy, do we have to question absolutely everything. And it's going to require a little additional evidence. So, one example of this we can find is in Sherlock Holmes. So Arthur Conan Doyle says, healthy skepticism is the basis for all accurate observation. So why does he say this? Well, he distinguishes between seeing and observing. And the story that he tells that he's referencing here is this idea that we see things all the time. And he talks about the steps in a building. He says, you know, how many times have you seen the steps up to the courthouse? Oh, I've seen them 1,000,000 times. How many steps are there? No answer. Because you see, but you don't observe. And when you're critically thinking, you're taking that extra step. You're observing. You're saying, am I what I think I see? Is that really what I'm seeing? And what more do I need to know about what I'm seeing? And we need to teach that to each other, and we need to teach that to the population that's out there. So how do we do that? Well, outside of INFOSEC, we're going to suggest that folks perhaps question what they see on websites, question the legitimacy of the email, and, you know, be aware of what they're seeing. Don't just assume that training once a year is going to be sufficient. Within INFOSEC, we need to be skeptical of fear-based marketing materials. Do we really want to buy products where, you know, and I get it, that may be the best product for whatever it is you're doing, but ask yourself, first of all, what problem am I trying to solve, and do I even really need a technology solution first? And second of all, if I have choices, is there a product I can throw my money at that isn't necessarily using all of their money to generate more fear? We can do that. We can also stop using lingo. And everybody's guilty of this. I occasionally do it too, but having come from the support universe, one of the things that I really try hard to do is to translate. So, you know, anytime I'm about to say something that I know is going to be technically over somebody's head, I don't want to talk down to them. I want to educate them. So I'm going to try to explain it in a way that I think they can grasp. So nuanced learning is going to replace fear. And again, this is that subtle shift. We're going to partner with our users online. I see all these people who are doing these phishing campaigns, and you see folks talking about we're going to catch our users doing things. Even thinking that way, we're already in a bad place. We have to change, we have to make this subtle shift even in our own heads. This is about helping everyone understand and get to more or less the same page. Using that language we already talked about and removing that us versus them. And of course, these are the basics, right? Go back to the basics. I mean, I won't spend any time on this because everybody knows who's got the data, the sensitive data. Where is it? Where are your physical assets? Monitoring your logs, fixing the simple things. I mean, these are the things that I do see people suggesting. So this is going to help as well. But don't let the goal of perfection be the enemy of good. You don't have to do something perfectly to do it better. And I am guilty of this as anybody because I was raised by a perfectionist who does everything a certain way because that's the way you do it. Well, sometimes that's not the way you should do it. That is not something that's ultimately going to get you anywhere. So education. We need to see and we need to tell people to start integrating from the bottom up. Security should not be this course or these courses you take after the fact. They should be ultimately it should be integrated into every single programming business class. I mean, this isn't just programming, really. We should be putting this into everything. If our business students understood why security mattered, by the time you're working with them in industry, we would have a much easier time. And I'm very fortunate because our computer science department and our School of Management actually work together really well, and we have a network defense course that's an interesting combination of both students. Predominantly the management students come out of MIS, but occasionally we get them from other disciplines, and they learn from each other, and it's really cool. And so they understand from the bottom up where these things come from. So at the end of the day, the stuff that the CS folks, the programmers are designing, and again, you know, I don't just mean this from a going to school perspective. Even if you're a self-learner, we need to have ways for the folks who are teaching themselves how to program to embed security into what they're learning. So that's all well and good for us at this level. But I'll be honest, I'm not a spring chicken. I'm certainly not the oldest one in the room, nor am I the youngest. But our generation is going to be tough. And why is it going to be tough? Because affecting change is hard. Getting people to change is a serious challenge. Anything that we want to change about ourselves How many people have tried to lose weight, quit smoking, get healthier, do more exercise? Like, is there anybody in here who hasn't had something a significant thing they wanted to change? I mean, you don't have anything you ever want to change? You're good? Okay, cool, nice. I wish I had your confidence, but I can tell you from personal experience, there's always things I want to change. And they're hard. You tell yourself, I'm going to do this, I got this, I'm going to be, and inevitably, we start over again, and we have to keep reminding ourselves how we're going to get there. We're creatures of habit. We haven't had that eureka moment because it's hard. These are some quotes from two gentlemen who wrote a book called Switch, which is a very interesting book steeped in business practices which talk about affecting change from the ground up. And if you're in an organization where your top level managers, you just don't see them changing, this is a really interesting book to check out because it's focused on making that change starting at the bottom and not at the top. Certainly having buy-in at the top makes all of this easier, but it doesn't mean that you can't affect change at all. It just means it's more challenging. So the reality is that these small changes can make a difference. Doesn't make it easy, but it can help. What we need to see, and this is another subtle change, is participation shift. What I heard Chris Roberts say I think it was on LinkedIn, and he mentioned it briefly in his talk, he suggested people bring non-security people to security conferences. I want you to take it a step beyond that. I'm not sure whether bringing non-security people to conferences is always the right move. I'm not sure I agree with that, but what I do agree with is we need to involve everybody else. And I mean everybody. Grandma, mom, baby sister, doesn't matter. We need to teach everybody from the ground up, again. And how we're really going to affect change, we're going to see is going to be the next generation. Because we're already fairly set in our ways, and we can do some change, and what good we can do would be awesome. But at the end of the day, it's that next generation I think we're going to see significant more change, but they have to learn from us. So we need to move away from these silos. We need to get involved. We need to teach in ways that we don't normally think of, and I'll give you a short example. I have a friend who works at the university. She works in an educational opportunity program. Wonderful lady, knows nothing about computers. She posts on Facebook. She's very frustrated because she got an email attachment that had a password. It was encrypted. And she says, what is with the redundant security? Now, what I could have done is I could have responded and I could have been really bitchy and said something like, what the hell? That's not redundant security. What do you know? Which is frequently a gut response from some of us. That never happens, right? We never do that. And instead I thought, opportunity. I can teach somebody something. Let's see where this goes. So I asked her on Facebook, public, or at least on our feeds, tell me more. What happened? So she explains about this encrypted attachment, and she says, I already log into my email, so why do I need to do this? Now, this is a woman who works with a lot of sensitive data because they have a lot of grants, federal grants that require Social Security number reporting and that sort of thing. So the reason this email was sent to her that way is because that's the only way that it could be sent encrypted, that she could get access to the data. I explained to her how there is no real security built into email by default, and that this is the reason why this is being done, and she learned something. And she's like, oh, okay, it's not redundant. I get it. You're right. It's not redundant. It doesn't mean it's any easier, but at least she understands now, and maybe there's an easier way for her support person to make this happen, and she won't be screaming at them like, this is so redundant. Why are we doing it this way? She knows. She understands it. But this is a really weird place to educate somebody, and what I find is you have to take these unique opportunities wherever you can find them. This next generation is going to be the bigger change. They're eager, they're already computer literate, they want to learn. So how are we going to hand off the baton? We're going to partner with these young folks. B-sides, Coder Dojo, summer camps, Odyssey the Mind, Hack for Kids, mentoring, anything you can do to get involved with our young people today, do it. Even if it's weird and awkward and challenging, the only way that the next generation will learn to avoid our mistakes is if we teach them what those mistakes are, and they don't figure that out 20 years later like we all did, going, oh, maybe that wasn't the way to handle it. So some final thoughts. Our number one goal isn't to secure the universe. It's to educate. Even if what our day-to-day job has to do with pen testing or has to do with defending, we're educators. If you're doing a pen test, your goal should be to take the results of that pen test and educate somebody in your report about what you found and why that matters. And you should know enough about whatever industry you're in, whatever company you're working for, and yeah, that means extra work. But that's how this is going to change. They won't care unless you tell them why they should care. They're going to care if you explain to them, here's why this matters, and it can't be just in terms of fear. It's just not effective. And learn what they know. There are people, I literally used to work with rocket scientists. These people were brilliant. They didn't know how to use Microsoft Word half the time, but they were brilliant in what they did know. So I would ask them, tell me some cool stuff about rocket science that I don't know. It doesn't have to be super technical. But any business you work in, there are people who've done things and seen things that are fascinating you won't know about unless you have those conversations. Educate, don't adjudicate. I got that quote from Chris Nickerson, and I think it's spot on. We often adjudicate, and it just leads us down a dark path. And with that, any questions? Yes?
Not really a question, but a comment.
Yep.
I've seen that work both ways. I've given demos to the work group trying to change stuff. And a lot of them learned from it and had questions and were inquisitive of what they wanted to do. A few of them actually became very fearful. Right? Their communication so careful balance you got to have there.
Yes.
Because some people automatically go, oh my goodness, throw away all the computers, throw away all the mistakes.
So the comment has to do with when you bring in outsiders, and when I say outsiders, that's what we're trying to change, right? This idea that they really are outsiders. When we bring in people who are not in our profession, it is very easy, even if we're presenting what we think is just very informative stuff, for them to be fearful. And I would agree. It can go both ways. Some people can get very interested and really be very curious and they want to know more, and some people can be more fearful. And so it's a delicate balance with how you present the material. I certainly have had the same experience. The only suggestion I can provide is to try to stay in touch with the people that you have found to be somewhat fearful and see what their fears are and try to see how you can address them. One of the things that I think is really important is talking about risk. I get asked all the time, what's the safest way to do something? And I tell them that there's no such thing. You have to decide what your risk tolerance is, whether you're a person or a company or an entity. It's context-based. And so you have to make those decisions for you. I can't tell you, don't do this. I can say, here's why I wouldn't do this and here's why. And so in my talks, when I use that language, I find that tends to be a little more effective than, oh my God, this is what's going to happen to you if this happens. And that's been, I think, the way we've often presented it because there's been no money in it otherwise. But I think if we push that envelope and start having these conversations with more people within an organization, the money will come because they'll see the benefit to it. Because the end should be, how do we help the company achieve their goal in a safer way? We're there as part of that. And if we're seen that way, instead of antagonistically, then ultimately we're better off. So thank you for your comment. Anybody else?